Hey, Rhett, thanks so much for joining me. Good to have you here on Zoom. How are you, bro?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me. I enjoy doing this stuff, so thanks for having me on.
Good, man. Well, I am so excited to talk with you because when I started the journey long ago, it was almost 3 years ago, to start my book on anxiety. Your book was the very first book that I bought off of Amazon. Going, okay, has anybody else written on anxiety and Christianity?
Uh,
And so to have a chance to talk to you is very, very awesome. So thank you for that chance. We'll get to the book later, but
yeah,
just thank you again for the
thank
opportunity.
you. I'm glad you read it, and I'm looking forward to having a conversation about this. I know we both have struggled with, so I enjoy having this conversation.
Yeah, good, good. Tell me a little bit about your family life, where you're at, maybe what occupies your day a little bit. Kind of give those who might be watching in a little bit of background about who you are as a person before we get into the topic and stuff we want to cover on anxiety.
Sure. I am married to my wife, Heather. We've been married for 15 years. We live up in kind of a suburb of Dallas, up in the area of Frisco, or the city of McKinney, technically about 25 miles north. We
Okay.
have a 13-year-old daughter and a 10-year-old son. And kind of what occupies my day is, or I should say my week, I split up my week between, I have a private practice. I'm a licensed marriage family therapist, so I work with couples, individuals, probably 2 or 3 days a week. And then the rest of the week, I do some executive coaching, I do some speaking, try to do some writing, and have
Yeah,
conversations like this. So,
that's
and
great.
I'm a former pastor, and so I do a lot of work with church leaders in our area and some other parts of the country. So I kind of enjoy splitting my time up doing various things. So
That's
that's
great.
fun.
That's great. When I told Cassie, my assistant, that I said, man, I'd love to talk with Rhett Smith, or maybe she brought it up. She's like, would you ever talk with him? I was like, of course, I would love to talk with him. She's like, well, I know him from Bel Air Prez. And I realized we had probably a couple lines in our life that have crossed with Mark Brewer
Yeah.
there, with Cassie. So I didn't realize that we were as close as we were when I first started reading your stuff. But that's pretty awesome, man. And then when did you move from California to Texas? Has that been years ago?
Yeah, my wife and I moved in about 2008 after our daughter was born. We just decided that the cost of living was, getting up there in California, and I was switching
Yeah,
careers from being a full-time pastor into really full-time counseling. And
yeah.
we have some family out in Texas. I was born in Texas, so that's kind of why we made the move out here, and we've enjoyed it. Been about 12 years.
That's great, man. That's a big move. That's great.
It is a big move.
Good. And you're also a runner, as I understand, not just like running around the block, but you do all sorts. You do all sorts of
Yeah,
things.
it's kind of the way that I manage my own anxiety and
Right?
stress. And started off with marathons, and the last big race I finished in February was a 100K trail run, so like 62 miles. And so
Amazing.
I I feel like that helps me grow as a person, kind of pushing through various challenges. So it's
Amazing.
fun.
100K. That's fantastic. That's cool, man. Good. Good. Well, I want to talk a little bit about your writing life. I have your book here, obviously, The Anxious Christian, that I've read and enjoyed very much. Thank you for putting this out. This isn't the only book that you've put out. You've spoken to men as well. You wrote a book called What It Means to Be a Man. And I know that there was a smaller version of that, or a snippet of that
Yeah.
that came out, The Four Reminders of a Men Who Love God. I'm excited to talk mostly about anxiety, though, as we go, if we have enough time. What I'd like to do is, towards the end of some of my questions, I want to focus in on men, specifically dealing with anxiety. But I also want to pull a little bit from your young adult pastor days and talk a little bit about how do we help young adults with anxiety. I think
Yeah.
your book applies to just about everyone, but I'm realizing, as I'm on this journey of speaking more about anxiety, the more pointed we can be to those who are maybe in specific stages of life. uh,
Yeah.
that's very helpful. So we'll get there, but I want to pull from that a little bit. I'm excited to read your What It Means to Be a Man. I haven't read it. I have it in a Kindle version, but I have not read it yet. But I'm excited to get to that. So maybe we can pull some content from that in
Yeah.
a little bit. But let's just talk about this misnomer of Christians being anxious. I mean, your title, in a lot of ways, kind of points to that. That can a Christian be anxious? I know when I first started my journey of talking about anxiety, I felt like, is it okay to say this out loud, that I have
Yeah.
anxiety? Like, can I tell people that? Because are Christians really supposed to be anxious? And especially counselors as you and I are, especially men of God, like, can we say that we're anxious? So can you just talk about that misnomer? Why do you think it is that anxiety seems to be something that maybe Christians don't call out as much as they should, or talk about as much as they should?
Oh man, that's a good question. I just think there's been a stigma of mental health issues in the church for so long. And I think if I had one thing about anxiety, I think it would be just the whole passage in Philippians 4:6, kind of taken out of context, where Paul says, don't be anxious. And I think we just kind of take those few words and we kind of isolate them from the rest of the context there in the book of Philippians or other parts of passages. And I think it's good intention by people. I think people mean well and they want to help people. But I think for so long, that's the phrase that is just stuck in people's head. And so there's this fear that I can't talk about this thing, anxiety or mental health issues. And
Yeah.
I say that just from my own experience, anxiety, and also just knowing when people sit in my office, that's what they cite the most. They say, I couldn't
Mm.
go talk to my pastor because my pastor said, Paul said, don't be anxious. And so
Yeah.
here I am talking to you. And I think it's also just hard for us to ask for help, especially men. If we're talking about men too, I think it's hard to reach out and to talk about something like anxiety because it's hard to wrap our hands and minds around what this is. If I have a physical ailment, I can kind of talk about or diagnose it, but anxiety, as you know, is really hard to conceptualize for people. And when they struggle with it, I think it's hard to communicate. When you can't communicate it, it's hard to get help, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah. That is profound, bro. I haven't thought about the misuse of Philippians 4:6, or the misunderstanding of it as kind of a slapping. You can't be anxious about anything, but really, rather what Paul's saying, and Paul even dealt with his own anxiety several different
Yeah.
times that he mentions.
Yeah.
He's saying you don't have to be anxious about
Yeah.
anything. But you're right. I think because of the popularity of that verse, there are times that it's misused and so, well, I can't talk about this, right? I can't say this, and that's not helpful to anyone. Why is it helpful? I mean, you seem to get to this in your book, but why is it helpful for us to acknowledge it? I mean, why should we be saying, hey, I'm dealing with anxiety? How is that helpful?
Well, and I think you kind of get to this in your book too. I mean, I think God obviously put us in a human body and we're wired in certain ways. And I guess how I frame it for people that come in to work with me is that um, anxiety, like depression or other things we struggle with, are simply indicators of like something going on in our life underneath the hood, if you will. And if
Yeah.
we pay attention to them and ask questions of them, I think it can really give us some sense of guidance. And I will never come out and say directly, okay, God's giving you that anxiety, but I think it's an
Yeah.
opportunity to come alongside of God, that anxiety is an opportunity to like stop and to turn towards God. And so um, I just tell people when they come to my office, it's like, they're driving in their car and they pay attention to the dials in their car. And if they pay attention to the dials, they get successfully to their journey. If you don't
Right.
pay attention to them, you end up stranded. And anxiety is one of those things that we need to pay attention to. And if we do, I think there's a huge opportunity for growth to
Yeah.
understand what's going on with me inside.
Yeah, you've talked about that. I can't remember if it's in your book or videos that I've watched, but I've heard you say specifically that anxiety and depression may not be a root issue, but it's kind of a fruit issue. It's something that's showing you that there's deeper work to be done.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, and it was my mentor, Terry Hargrave, who helped me really understand that anxiety is not a feeling, but it's a response to something. I become
yeah,
anxious because maybe, for example, underneath, I feel like I'm worthless or I'm inadequate. And so I feel like if we stay at the symptom level and just try to treat anxiety and depression, we miss an opportunity to kind of go deeper and to heal maybe a wound,
yeah,
or to understand maybe some kind of brokenness that we have to address in our lives. And
yeah.
so I think yeah, again, anxiety is like a signpost to say there's something deeper and let's dive into that.
I love that. I love that. You speak of failure there, just when you talk about that, of either fear of failure, maybe some worth kind of thing that's happening underneath, where
Hmm.
you feel upset and anxious because there's something going on related to maybe I'm not good enough, or maybe I won't be accepted, or maybe I'll fail again,
Hmm.
or the failures of my past will haunt me. Can we talk a little bit about the role of failure and anxiety? How do you, as a counselor, suggest that a Christian chases down those deeper things, especially as they relate to worth issues or failure issues in their life?
Yeah, man, that's doing the work you do. And that's a really hard question. I think you know I guess I would say first and foremost, I really want people to understand the patterns they get stuck in. And I kind of look at Paul's language in Ephesians 4. There's this old self and new self at work. And Paul
Mm-hmm.
talks about daily taking off that old self and putting on the new self. And so I think if people can understand the patterns and what triggers their anxiety, and then, I think the real challenge is to help them understand their identity in Christ, right?
Yeah.
How God sees them, that in this moment, even though I feel like a failure and I'm becoming anxious, the truth is that I do have worth, that I am valuable. And just because you say that doesn't mean it sets in, right? I think this is where like practice and prayer and just repeating that over and over again and trying new things that communicate to myself that I do have worth. And so,
Yeah.
for clients, a lot of time, I don't love this phrase, but I say you kind of have to fake it till you make it sometimes. You have to really believe that you have worth, and you have to start doing some things that if I were watching you would communicate, hey, that person has worth. And I think over time,
Mm.
this is where Paul's ahead of the game. I think Paul, Philippians 4:7, he talks about like meditating on these things. So the more that we
Yeah.
meditate on the truth about who we are, I think it shapes our beliefs, and
Yeah.
those beliefs start to shape our actions. And it's a long-term work. So
Yeah.
it's
Good.
definitely not a quick fix, I don't believe.
Yeah, that's good. And just what you're highlighting there is worth in Christ, identity in Christ.
Yeah.
Some of my worst anxiety and the panic attacks that I experienced were related to my own failure, right? I
Yeah.
talk about in my book about how the consequences of sin and the consequences of choices, well, God, like you said, I don't think God gives us anxiety or pushes that upon us, but sometimes he allows it to happen. But I will
Right.
tell you, even in light of my failure or worth issues or the panic related to them, when I finally pushed in and saw my value to Christ,
Yeah.
that's when all of a sudden it wasn't like anxiety went away, but all of a sudden the deeper issue was being dealt with. It wasn't this
Yeah.
peripheral, let's deal with anxiety. It was, no, let's deal with something much deeper and more important than anxiety. And I just don't think many anxious Christians understand that, right? This isn't just dealing with the symptoms, but it's going deeper.
Yeah. And I'm part of this group that does this movement kind of called restoration therapy that Terry Hargrave at Fuller founded. And I kind of walk through these four steps where it's like, okay, right now I'm feeling like I don't measure up.
Yeah.
And when I don't measure up, what I normally do is I become anxious. Okay. But the truth is, I I know that God loves me. Therefore, I'm going to take a deep breath and I'm going to go ahead and go out on that stage and try to talk, right?
Mhm.
And I
Yeah.
have to go out and I have to do that over and over again and trust that God will show up. And it's through the repetitive pattern of that I think I start to believe in who I am in God's eyes. And
Yeah.
for some people that happens in an instant, right? And for some
Yeah.
people it's a long journey over a period of years.
Yeah. So if I were to ask you, do you still deal with anxiety? How would you answer that question?
Yeah, I do, and I probably have a little bit of anxiety every day, but I think the beautiful thing in it is that I've learned, at least up to this point, to manage and to understand tools and resources and understand, done lots of therapy work. And I think there's been lots of healing in my life. And, in the book I talk about, I struggle with stuttering. And on occasion,
Hmm.
if I go up and speak, you might pick up on that. Most people are like, dude, I had no idea.
Right. Yeah.
It's a part of the struggle. And I feel like um, it always will be this
Yeah.
anxious part. And part of me feels like I don't necessarily want it all to go away, because I feel like it really helps me lean in and trust God that I have to depend upon him in all situations in my life.
Bro, that is the beauty of brokenness right there, what you just said, that there's almost this wish that it doesn't fully go away. I mean, it's reminding me of Paul's thorn a little bit, of like he
Yeah.
begged for it to go away, but then sometimes the thorn becomes a friend, right? And sometimes
Yeah.
the things that are the hardest in our life are the very things that show us the beauty of the gospel.
And I know
And
this isn't
go ahead.
a great, I'm not comparing these two, but
Yeah.
it's like a sprinter on the starting line before the gun goes off, right? If they don't have any butterflies
Yeah.
or they're not feeling that anxiety, it's going to be a flat race for them. There's going to
Yeah.
be no energy. They're going to, they're not going to come off the blocks. And so
Yeah.
I guess I want to feel that anxiety. I write in the book sometimes it makes me feel like I'm alive sometimes, and that
Mhm.
God is like at work, and that I have to like pursue after God. Without it, I feel sometimes that I don't care about certain things then.
Yeah. Yeah. Anxiety compels us to greater dependence upon God. But I
Yeah.
think, like you just highlighted there in your last sentence, it also makes us realize we're a raw ball of nerves at times, you know, and
Yeah.
we need his loving comfort in our life.
Yeah.
I love that. Thanks for being honest about that. And one of the things you said before your own anxiety is that, you know, sometimes you just got to keep pushing through, and the repetition, or I'll say, when people ask me, how do you deal with your anxiety on a regular basis? Well, I have a lot of reps in, you know, I've had to do a lot of reps dealing with my anxiety. And there is something about the more you push in on your identity in Christ, the more reps you have dealing with this brokenness in your life, there's a point where, to use your phrase, you just manage it a little bit better with the power
Hmm.
of Christ in your life. So
Yeah. And
that's
and I feel like I live a full life,
yeah,
but there are moments where anxiety gets me down and I got to really work hard. And there are days where I'm like, oh yeah, there's a little bit of anxiety, but I'll be okay. And I just kind of work through it, and it's barely noticeable.
yeah, that's good. That's good. You talk a lot about boundaries in your book. There's several themes of it, and then there's even a chapter in there you kind of directly hit it. I want to talk about boundaries just a little bit. Why are boundaries important for the person who's dealing with anxiety? Maybe we should back up for a second. I think you and I kind of understand what boundaries are, but maybe if you'll do a little bit of definition. When we say boundaries, what do we mean? Or when you say boundaries, what do you mean? And then I'd love for you to speak to either different types of boundaries, or at least the reason why boundaries are important for an anxious person.
Yeah, you may have to help me unpack this because it's the phrase I use a lot, and I kind of pull it out of the old, which is a great book still, the Henry Cloud and John
Yeah.
Townsend book, Boundaries. But
Yep.
it's kind of knowing where you begin and end in relationship with people.
Yeah, that's
And
good.
by a boundary, I mean I know what I'm responsible for, what emotions I have to be responsible for. Um, when do I need to step in and help, and when do I got to let the other person take care of things? It's like in the book they talk, it's like this fence line. We kind of
Yep.
know it. And the reason they're important is anxiety is kind of like a virus, and you can sense if someone's anxious around you. And if you don't
Yeah.
have clear boundaries about who you are, you can kind of absorb and end up taking on their anxiety
Yeah.
in some really unhealthy ways. And I think this really happens with kids. When kids are young, they don't have a good sense of self often and boundaries. And if a mom or dad is really anxious in the house, kids will kind of tend to absorb that. So
Yep.
if I'm an adult and I'm struggling with anxiety, the more aware I am of that, the more I try to take responsibility for that, the less I'm kind of unconsciously or consciously putting my anxiety off on other people, or
Yeah.
making myself other people kind of more like dependent on me to fix me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I talk about areas of concern. This is from Stephen Covey, but I've
Yeah.
kind of biblicalized it and made it a little more biblical. But areas of concern, and then areas of influence, and then I talk about areas of accountability. But I think that's what you're getting at. There are times where there are a lot of things we're concerned about, right? It could be politics, it could be the stock market, it could be the way that lady looks at me at work every time she walks past my cube, right? I mean, these are things I'm concerned about, but I can't control. And I
Hmm.
think knowing the boundaries within that is important for the anxious person. The areas that we can influence, there
Yeah.
need to be those boundaries and those fence lines. So
Yeah, that's a good point about what do we feel like we have control over
yeah,
in our lives and what we don't.
yeah, there might be a lot of things we're concerned about, but we can't
Yeah.
control them, you know, and
Yeah.
that's been helpful for me with my anxiety. But I found that to be a really powerful part of your book. You talk about boundaries a lot. I've been writing more on boundaries and speaking on it lately. I hope to publish a work on that in the future. But I think I've gone back to your book just even in the last few weeks as I've been thinking and speaking and writing about it. And you have some really profound thoughts about why it's important for our life. I wanted to figure out, is our boundaries biblical? I mean, there
Hmm.
is that great book and classic work
Yeah.
by Townsend and Cloud, but it was published in 92. It came out to kind of say, hey, here's how we deal with relationships, but is that the way we're supposed to address them? And what I came to find was, yes, there's a lot in there that we are supposed to use, but applying it to the anxious person, boundaries are a piece of the pie. It's not the
Yeah.
total way you deal with anxiety. If you're only putting fence lines up, but
Yeah.
not getting at the deeper roots, like we talked about earlier, you're not actually probably getting after the real thing. Because an anxious person, and I've been there, right? All of a sudden, I went through 4 months where I got rid of a cell phone. I got rid of extra email addresses that I didn't need. I mean, I tried to cut off the world. And in my worst seasons of anxiety, I thought, I'll just shut everybody out, right? But that's not often the best way to handle it. Or maybe it's fine for a season, but it can't be the long term. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and it gets really messy, in the psychological literature, there's like this 50 cent word of self differentiation. It's like how we
Yeah,
differentiate ourselves
yeah,
from others. And I think even in the creation story, right, the idea of man and woman, there's a differentiation of self, but we're also one.
yeah,
um, there's an I and a you in a relationship, but we're also us and
yeah,
we. And so it's never clear cut always when you're in the messiness of life and there's messiness and anxiety. But I think sometimes if you have a clearer sense of who you are, you can kind of figure out what you got to be responsible for. And in a relationship and community, then it also allows people to come in and figure out how they can help you too.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so it's just, when I use the word boundaries, I use it a lot, in counseling, but then I'm like, you know what, I got to really unpack that because it's
yeah.
vague sometimes.
Yeah, yeah, it's vague in a Christian world. I mean, I've read
Yeah.
a lot about self-differentiation. I forgot the woman that kind of first founded that theory, but she's written a lot on it. A lot of people have. It's a, it's right. There is a sense of that as we grow up, and she talks a lot about childhood development. That was kind of where that first started coming out. But in Christian world, we have these passages that say you're part of a body. You're
Yeah.
connected to other people. Like, wait, hold on a second. Wait a second. How does that work? And you're right. I think we have to unpack it. And but Rhett, I want to say, I think you did. I think you did
Yeah.
very well in your writing. I think you did a good job of saying there's a place for this when you're dealing with anxiety, Christian. You anxious
Yeah.
Christian. There is a place for this, and part of I want to highlight one of the things that I think you get too often is sometimes it is to allow God to make his purposes most clear in the midst
Yeah.
of anxiety. And I sat with a counselor yesterday and said, hey, listen, we got to stop the voices. There's just too many voices in your life, right? You,
Yeah.
you have way too many people right now trying to tell you what they think your problem is. And we have to stop and come back and say, God, what are you doing in this? Or to use your book and your thesis there is, what's your good in this? What are you doing here, right? How are you forming me? And I do think there can be a place for cutting some things out or setting limits and drawing lines so that we can hear the word of God a little clearer.
Yeah. And I'm thinking about your question again. I mean, if I just set boundaries in my life, I would have ended up avoiding all situations that would have put me in contact with my greatest fear, which was talking in front of people, right? And
Yeah,
at some point in my life, it was my junior in college, I felt like God had clearly said, you're not living the life I desire for you. It's not life abundant. And so I knew that I had to do more than just set these boundaries. I had to really face my deepest fears and go for some deeper healing. And so I felt like in that situation, anxiety was the thing that was actually propelling me to live more like God wanted me to live. And so that's where it becomes messy, right? I can't just do this over here and isolate this. I have to, it has to somehow all be integrated at some point.
yeah, that's good. That's super good. Good. All right, let's turn towards, you mentioned dealing with it in your college years. Let's turn towards the young adult, the college student. That's something that I frankly have not spoken to with the anxiety message very firmly. I've done a lot of speaking to young adults and college kids and high school kids, but never applied the message of anxiety. So knowing that that's a part of your past, meaning that you pastored young
Yeah.
adults, let's just think through, how do you help the person that's maybe post high school, but maybe into mid 30s, that's trying to make sense of life? There's a couple ways we could come at this. What are some of the anxieties that might be plaguing them? And then how do you best apply this message of your book and to the hope of God doing something good in their life in the midst of anxiety? Can you just kind of speak to that person for a
Ye-
bit?
Yeah. And I wrote the book in 2011, 12. So there's so many things I've learned since then, but I, I think when you're talking about a young adult, you're looking at a lot of issues of transition, right? You're talking about leaving college, maybe becoming more dependent. You're talking about the possibility of entering into a relationship, like a commitment, like a marriage or dating, which brings about anxiety.
Yeah.
You're talking about the prospect of a career, which brings about anxiety, which then you're talking about the prospect of more some type of financial responsibility
Hmm.
more that brings about anxiety. You're talking about the possibility in the 20s and 30s of bringing kids into the world. So there's all these different intersections, I think, that will bring about a sense of anxiety for people. And I think how I would address it with people is, one, I always, if someone's in my office, I say, let's take the stigma out of it. Let's reframe it as an opportunity from growth. This doesn't mean you're a bad person or something's wrong with you, but there's a potential opportunity. And you see people just like they've never heard something like that before. So I want to reframe it as this anxiety in your life is potentially a gift that you can use to grow in the way that God wants you to grow. And then two, I want to name what that anxiety is, meaning I want to understand the patterns and where you're getting stuck, where that old self is at work, and help you build kind of a new self and understand God's role in your life and God's how God sees you. And then three, that's a long process, but I know there's daily anxieties you got to deal with. So three, I want to give you some tools and some resources just to kind of daily manage the anxiety you might feel while we're doing this deeper work. So for me, those things are all integrated. Let's reframe it. Let's do the deeper work and really name what's going on. And then three, let's practice some tools and some basic resources like breathing and calming yourself down,
Yeah, that's good.
or some kind of prayer work that will help you navigate the journey. And if I can do those three things, I think there's a huge opportunity there to grow.
Yeah, that's good. And that reframing thing, to start there, but then end at the tools, and giving them tools is powerful, because you're right. You have to reframe it before you just start applying tools. I think that's what happens in a poor way in the church at times. We just start throwing tools at people
Yeah.
before we get to the deeper work in the middle, like you said. I say to my counselees often, I want to give you a Home Depot sized tool chest of tools, but before I start building the shed of tools in your life, or the massive box store of tools in your life, I have to get to the deeper issues. We have to start working on some of those deeper issues. So I like that. And I think that's true.
And I think,
Go ahead.
and I think, if someone sits in your office to do counseling or in the role of pastor, this may be my only shot.
Yeah.
They may not come back. And I think most importantly, I want them to feel emotionally, spiritually safe in my presence, that. And I think the greatest way to do that is to help them understand that there's an opportunity for growth here. And just because you have anxiety doesn't mean, something is wrong with you or you're a bad person. Now, could the anxiety be brought about by things you're not supposed to be doing? Sure.
Yeah.
But anxiety, really, let's just call it what it is and let's settle into it. And I think people feel a real sense of peace there. And that allows you, I think, to do the deeper stuff that you can't do if you just dive into it.
Yeah. I love that. Love that. Cool. Now let's speak to men for a second. I don't think men are always good at doing the deeper work, if we're honest.
Yeah.
So we finally get something that blows up in our life and we realize we have to. But just speak to men who deal with anxiety a little bit. Again, you've written to men before. You direct us to be men of God. I think part of being a man of God, I think you would agree, is dealing with some of these deeper things. But how would you apply this idea of anxiety, or God using anxiety for his good, to the man who might be listening?
Again, that's a good question. If you look at the statistics, men are less likely just to get help, and the numbers are lower on depression, anxiety for men. But again, I think that's because it's due to underreporting. I don't think guys reach out for help as much. And so, man, I think there's going to have to be a shift, because I think as men for so long, we feel like something is wrong with us if we have to ask for help, And so I always want to change the conversation that you asking for help really is an opportunity to become an even greater man and a greater, I don't know what the right word is, tool, but a greater gift to your family and to your community when you can actually work on this anxiety and depression, that you don't have to live this way, that if we address this, it can really free you up to be who you were created to be. But I still think there's a lot of work there culturally for guys to reach out for help. And so I always tell people, especially pastors that I work with, I think the message has to come top down. Like,
that's
it's
good.
okay if you're a guy and you struggle with anxiety. It's okay.
Yeah.
Like, that's normal. It's part of being human. And so you have to create a safe place for them and not only name it and say it's okay, but to say, hey, we're going to do the best we can in this community to make it safe for you to talk about the things that you struggle with. And I think if you can communicate that from the top down and create a safe environment, I think you can start seeing men really engage those issues. Because I work with a lot of men, man, and their wives say, oh, he's not going to talk to you. And then they get in their room and they cannot stop talking. They just want to talk. And so we have to create those places.
Yeah, I know. Dude, I love what you said. That's tweet worthy, but the man who gets help might be of greater use to his family or the kingdom. I mean, we just have to realize that getting help is okay. Even
Yeah.
healthy people get counseling, and
Yeah.
counseling doesn't mean you're broken. Talking to someone else, seeking help from your church doesn't mean that you're some used product that just should be thrown in the trash. But God can do something great for that. And I do wish more men would be honest about it. Even since the publication of my book, I can't tell you the number of women that have reached out to me saying, "Will you please call my husband?"
Yeah.
We're talking coast to coast, right? They're saying, "Will you
Yeah.
please call my husband? He's dealing with anxiety, but he doesn't want to admit it." And I'm like, "No, you can help him with this. There's people in your life that can help him with this. But at the end of the day, he's got to come to the realization of, I need help, right?
Yeah.
And me just calling everybody who someone else thinks is anxious isn't going to get them to talk. But when they finally realize the power of brokenness, and we see this in King David, we see this in the Apostle
Yep.
Paul. I mean, we see this in people who are used greatly by God, loved greatly by God. But when they finally admit, I'm busted up, I'm a busted man, I got a lot of issues, but God can still use me. That's where the beauty of the gospel comes through.
And I think it's what you said there. I think it's because the Bible's messy, but we tend to sanitize it a lot in our stories and preaching. And I think it's like being honest about, even if the word anxiety is not mentioned specifically in that text, being 40 years in the wilderness had to be an anxious, provoking journey, and to
Right.
talk about that. Or there in the book of Philippians, I point out that the same word that Paul uses for anxiety in 4:6, he uses in 2:20 to describe Timothy as having anxiety, but
Yeah.
it's framed as care, concern for the
Yeah.
community.
Yeah.
And then Paul, you're right. In 2:28, he talks about the lessening of his own anxiety. And so for us to be able to say, hey, Paul does say don't be anxious, but he's someone he's wrestled with it, could maybe free men to be like, oh, it's okay. Like, I
Yeah.
don't have to have it all together.
I love that. I love that. And it's actually gives a chance for the gospel to be made more beautiful when you don't
Yeah.
pretend you have it all together, So yeah,
Yes.
good. Bro, I could talk to you all day long. I think we need to get you out here and have you come to
I
Colorado.
love Colorado, man. So anytime.
It'd be fun to have you here, man. I love that. But uh, if people want to get more of your content, or they want to just be exposed to anything you're doing, or even if let's say they live in the Texas area, how do they find you? What's the best way for them to be in contact with you or find out more from you?
Yeah, I think the best for everything, if you just Google my name, there's not a lot of Rhett Smith, but it's just my website, rhettsmith.com, kind of has everything on there.
Great.
I have an office in Plano, Texas, and we just put out a new resource. Barna did with part of this kind of pastor group I do stuff with on basically like mental health and all these issues we struggle with in our relationships. And
Cool.
if you Google Barna and restoring restoring relationships, you'll see that resource pop up. It's on my website. I think it's a good resource for pastors and people in ministry to kind of look at. And I specifically talk about anxiety and depression in that book as well. And so it's,
Mm.
and then if people have any questions, I'm always, I'm more than happy to respond via email. So it's just rhett@rhettsmith.com. If you have any questions or, want to ask me about something, I'd be happy to help.
Thanks, dude. That is a servant's attitude. Thank you. I can't wait to go read that other thing. I didn't know that was out, so I will go find that and I'll read that. Thank you, bro. I just want to encourage anyone who's watching, please go get The Anxious Christian. I think it's a great resource. This is the newer cover when it was kind of, but I was looking through this today. Just today, I rode with my wife to take our kids to carpool, and I was
Yeah.
looking back through some of my notes and highlights and dog ears, and then I go to the back page. We're kindred spirits, bro. My first book is in the back of your book.
Is it really? I didn't even notice that. I
Isn't
have to
that
go back and
crazy?
look at that. That's hilarious.
I know. They did the same thing on my book. Like, you have no control what they put in the back. But
Right.
I thought, well, I was like, what? No way. Honest to God's in the back. But I'm just
That's
honored to
funny.
get to work with you, to have a chance to talk with you today, and to work with you in the same area of just helping anxious Christians find the hope of Jesus Christ. So thank you for this time, bro. Thank you for your words of wisdom. And maybe we should do this again on even a different topic. But I love talking to you. So thanks so much.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
For sure, bro.